Obama family, they're from a kind of mainline Protestant background, and the Biden family, they're from a Catholic background, and the Bush family, they're an evangelical background, and the Palin family, Pentecostal. And they have a fence, and they don't trust each other too much because they worship differently and they have different theology. That is, the grandparents don't trust each other too much, but the grandchildren, they sometimes play together. They play kickball together. They play softball together. And even though they know they're not supposed to like each other, they kind of become friends. And as they grow up, somebody in the Obama family grows up and they've learned a lot in their faith about social justice. But, you know, the Palin kids, like when they go to church and they worship, they sort of have a good time and it's kind of aerobic and there's a lot of enthusiasm and passion. And they're kind of attracted to some of that worship. And at the same moment, the Palin kids, they've been praising God and singing and learning Bible verses. And they keep finding these Bible verses about loving the poor and doing justice and loving kindness. And they ask their parents about that, and they don't really know much about that. So these kids sneak out to the back fence every once in a while, and they get information from each other that neither of them can get from their own family. And meanwhile, the Biden family, they're Catholic background, and they know a lot about liturgy, and they know a lot about reverence, and they've got great tradition and history, and they can quote an encyclical like nobody's business. And they, every once in a while, sneak out to the back fence because the Bush family, they really learn the Bible and they memorize Bible verses and they have a lot of understanding. And they, every once in a while, find out that the Bush kids, they know the Bible, but they hear so much preaching, they would just like a little bit of silence every once in a while. And these guys over here know something about contemplative silence. And you can get the idea what happens when people start sneaking out to the back fence and they learn they have a lot to learn from each other. They don't want to change their name. They don't want to go move into the other family, but they would like to be openly in friendship with each other. And they'd like, when they think about their generation, they would like their future to be influenced by the people who their parents studiously avoided. That's my parable of convergence.
That's great. Hi, welcome to Darkwood Brew. I'm Eric Ellis, your host, and Darkwood Brew is that place where ancient Christian mystical practice is blended with modern interactive web technology, world-class jazz, arts, biblical scholarship. Well, you never know exactly what's going to happen. You may wonder why I'm standing out in the middle of a parched Iowa cornfield wearing a suit. Well, I'm actually standing next to an old Lutheran church after having performed a wedding ceremony for a couple in my congregation. You know, wedding is very much a convergence of two people who are oftentimes very different from one another, but who come together, and in that coming together there's a special energy created that neither one could produce on their own. A spiritual flow, so to speak, that really wouldn't be produced if both partners were exactly alike. It's their differences, like the differences of a course of a stream, that actually brings them together in that convergence. Well, this evening we'll be going over another form of convergence, taking a look at a strange and interesting and quite hopeful convergence going on in America right now between what might be called post-evangelical Christians and post-liberal Christians. Two streams that have been flowing parallel to one another, but gradually coming closer and closer, discovering that the other is not as strange as they once supposed, that the other doesn't have the baggage associated with them that they had once found years ago, and the other has strange and wondrous gifts to offer. Our guest this evening in this special extended episode on Convergence Christianity is Brian McLaren. That's not people cheering for Brian, that's actually cheering for the wedding couple who's coming out right now. But let's raise a cheer for a new convergence amongst people who used to consider themselves enemies, or at least suspects, into a new future together in Christ's name. But before we go any further, let's take a look at what happened, well, not last week, but rather last time we had Brian on the show.
is your name?
Sir Galahad of Camelot.
What is your quest?
I seek the Grail.
What is your favorite color?
Blue. No.
Darkwood Brew. God is still speaking in Nebraska.
As you stand on top of this Areopagus Hill, you see all of the grandeur that is Athens, the Temple of Apollo right there, and the great statues to their military victories, and you see all the signs of their material wealth and power. This is a photograph of some of the, we have 50 volunteers who work on Darkwood Brew throughout the month here at Countryside Church, and they are all smiling at you, wishing you well in the Psalms project, and they've signed it. And
that's great. That's wonderful. So, thank you all so much. I really, truly appreciate that.
There's this fear that if we don't demonize them, everybody who's part of us will want to go join them. As if there's nothing in our own community of real value to keep us here. And of course, as a Christian, I'm far more drawn by the beauty of Jesus and the wonder of his message and the amazing dimensions of his good news of the kingdom of God. That's enough to keep me as a follower of Jesus.
Real milk chocolate, delicious peanut butter. Two great tastes that taste great together.
Reese's? Yeah.
Reese's peanut butter cups. This is pretty good, huh? Yeah. Darkwood Brew, now sponsored by Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. Actually, that's kind of a metaphor for Convergence Christianity, I think, where two groups of people who kind of had their own ways of doing things, who've kind of left their native traditions, either emotionally or physically, and then kind of bumping into each other out there in the wilderness and discovering, oh, that's pretty good stuff.
Tasty.
Yeah, it is tasty. Yeah, we've been really surprised. In the last year and a half we've been doing Darkwood Brew. We really started Darkwood Brew feeling like our primary group of people who would be tuning in with us would be people. A lot of them would be from the mainline, more liberal traditions who were looking for commitments to social justice, inclusivity, non-literal readings of the Scripture, and so forth, but who were also looking for things that they weren't finding in their tradition, more attention to the Bible, Jesus, Holy Spirit stuff, and personal attention, or attention to a personal spiritual path that we develop. And what we found since we've been broadcasting and webcasting and incasting is that you're not necessarily from a mainline church if you're watching Darkwood Brew, that you're actually coming from a wide variety of perspectives and traditions. We have a lot of folks who are part of the Evangelical church or might consider themselves post-Evangelical. and a lot of folks who just kind of had left the church altogether and are still looking for community. And it's part of, I think, it's how we've been noticing a convergence in Christianity. And you had all kinds of viewers. We had people this week kind of spreading the word about this special extended episode on convergence.
We did. We opened a conversation about Brian McLaren going to be with us here tonight, and it just shot off all kinds of conversations out there. And what we find is that we have people that we rely on our own audience to be able to spread the word about who's coming, and it's just incredible how that's taken off.
Yeah.
Eric Ludke talks about that he was going to be on an airplane. Otherwise, he would be tied to his computer, but he says this might be worth paying the $12 internet access for on the plane.
Right. Eric, if you're out there, welcome. Send us a chat.
Yeah. You don't have to push the donate button since you paid for the internet. That's good.
That's right. I've actually seen Darkwood Brew from an airplane. That's really kind of a surrealistic thing. It's neat.
And Jennifer Palin says this is beyond denominations,
Yeah,
which is
that's
a
right.
big thing. Which is funny because then Kama says that you can check it out, that it's a streaming podcast, and having had just 2 days with Brian, she's interested in this conversation. So Brian was the one that introduced her to this idea of Convergence Christianity and what we're doing here at Darkwood, and so now she's coming here. I noticed Melvin Bray was on Facebook and said that he was inviting all his people.
Great.
We have Hudson River Presbytery. Those are people that our own folks have shared the Darkwood Brew announcements with, and so then they turn around and share it with their community, and there's like 115 shares out of each one that you give it to. It just spreads out huge.
That's powerful. So really, this is how Darkwood Brew really spreads and how we all become connected to each other. We don't have a marketing agency or anything like that. It's simply through word of mouth, and it's neat to see it spreading.
And everybody loves Brian.
That's
Martha
right.
says, I've enjoyed all and reviewed many of his books and have never been the same.
Yeah.
Jello, I think is the name. My, oh my, Brian McLaren, my idol. So that's, we got a whole
we
group
don't want to get
coming
into idolatry here, but
Robert Hurst says, bring on the convergence. So the word is getting around. It is spreading out there. We have a new Facebook page called Convergence Christianity that's hoping to spread even farther now, so you can get on that and like that as well. And then Diane Wheaton says, just purely, this is awesome.
yeah.
So-
Great. That's
So
awfully
we're
nice.
happy to have
Feels
all
good.
of our viewers with us and sharing our Facebook information with as many people as you can. Sancta Sophia Seminary in Oklahoma City, they were one of the ones that spread it out further from where we are, and the United Church of Canada.
Yeah, that's right.
There was a place, another 2 or 3 Lutheran churches, which
Well, there
you
we
know,
go, yeah.
I didn't even do that. So
The Lutheran in our midst.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Great. Well, it really feels good, and it feels like we're all in this very much together. This is really work that we're all putting together, and that's one of the things that actually Phyllis Stickle was recognizing. She just came out with a book this last week called Emergence Christianity. I was told on Amazon that wouldn't be out till September, but when I came in this morning, I saw it in my box, and this is a really interesting book. I haven't read it all because I just got it this morning, but one of the things that makes it interesting is photographs and description of Darkwood Brew right there. She's got a really nice write-up on Darkwood Brew and photographs, and has recognized that Darkwood Brew is really changing a paradigm in terms of how church operates, where it is non-hierarchical, and it's a work of a network of people now, rather than just simply somebody at the top. And
yeah, and I think Facebook plays that out beautifully.
yeah. And incidentally, there's going to be a conference coming up in January. If you'd like to deepen the conversation here that we're kind of gathering on Convergence Christianity, a conference that's actually dedicated to Phyllis Stickles, exploring Phyllis Stickles' new book. She will be talking there, but we'll also be extending the conversation into kind of what is emerging is now converging. So if you'd like to come to that conference, you would love to have you there in January. Darkwood Brew has actually just come on board as a sponsor of that conference. So
Yay.
yeah, I'll be there, and hopefully several brewers. So that'll be great. Well, also, just before we head into Brian, we want to mention also that we have a new series that will be starting next week, actually. And that new series is called Failing, Falling, and Flying, Genesis Stories of Original Grace. And we'll be featuring next week as our Skype guest Kevin Miller, who's the director of a film curiously called Hellbound, with a question mark. I met him at the Wild Goose Festival, and boy, he's a great guy, and he offered to send me an advance copy of his film, and I watched it, and I was transfixed. Both my wife and I, we were just completely transfixed by it. This is a really, really good kind of overview of the variety of views about heaven and hell, and where the thinking about afterlife comes from. And one of the things I noticed about that film is that Christianity is really moving away from where it has been, number one, on that subject, has been in most recent years, into a much more generous spirited recognition, I think, of the generous spirit of God. But also, one of the things that comes out is that a lot of the angst people have about why there needs to be a hell is related to what they think happened at the beginning in the Garden of Eden and what they call original sin in the garden. And that's going to be actually the subject of our next series. We're going to spend 6 weeks exploring, was that original sin really? And that needs to be then fixed by Christianity? What if we've actually been misreading that? We're going to be exploring not only the Genesis text in creation, but also continuing through Cain and Abel, the flood, and so forth. And we're going to see an interesting pattern that strongly suggests what's going on in the garden is the author's not talking about original sin so much as original grace. And it's not just simply to say that, hey, it's all just fuzzy and now we can, just love each other and isn't life just wonderful and we never have any problems, there's no such thing as evil or anything like that. Original grace suggests something very different. It's not just the opposite of original sin is not like
Paradise.
Paradise, yeah. Or some people talk about original blessing in very, kind of high-sounding terms like, humans can never do any good. We're going to see a very different pattern, and we'll be exploring that over 6 weeks. So I just want to play just a brief trailer, if I could, from that film, Hellbound, and we'll be having the director on next week. Let's play that.
Where do liars go? Where do murderers go? Where do the rapists go? Have you ever lied before? Then you're a liar. You just qualified yourself to go to hell.
Welcome to hell.
If you believe in God, you have to believe in hell.
The suffering is beyond human imagination.
Weeping, gnashing of teeth, wailing, outer darkness, and there is no second chance after death.
But God loves everybody. No.
Traditional views of hell make God look like a mean tyrant hell-bent on retributive justice.
God is holding the guilty sinner like a spider over a fire, and God is angry at the spider.
And I think what we're trying to say to your question about hell and all these other things is, who is this God? Because if you get that wrong, everything's wrong.
Jesus, I have a question for you. Is anybody going to hell?
We'll let him think so, and maybe it'll help him act better.
Our whole theological system has been boiled down to a hell avoidance plan.
The whole concept of hell is really used to terrorize people into the faith.
How do I get you to do what I want you to do? Well, if you don't conform, don't worry just about what I'll do to you in this lifetime. God hates you too, and he'll punish you, wait a minute, how long? Forever.
People are afraid that if you rethink hell, the whole system will come crumbling down.
If we remove God's wrath against sinners, Christianity starts to not make sense.
So you base the entire religion on fear of hell, fear of punishment, fear of God's wrath, and what happens to the gospel where it teaches you not to fear?
Failing, Falling, and Flying. That will be our next series. Hope you can join us for that. Well, this is a special episode, as we mentioned, on Convergence Christianity. So Darkwood Brew is operating slightly differently than we normally do. For those of you who have been with us before, we will not be doing a Pneuma Divina reading this evening, which is based on the ancient Lectio Divina and looking at a biblical text and exploring that. But rather, the format of the evening we'll have 3 primary conversations, 2 of which are between Brian and myself, and hopefully you're on chat too, and you can be already starting about thinking about questions you may be asking, and certainly carrying on the conversation as it goes. Brian and I will be exploring convergence from a couple of different angles, and then the third segment will be you asking questions, making comments. We'll be featuring in the coffee house crowd and the internet community as much as we possibly can. And Scott Grissell, our producer, has chosen 3 snippets from previous episodes of Darkwood Brew, just brief snippets that kind of from people you know, Diana Butler Bass, Frank Schaefer, and this next clip will be from actually Melvin Bray, who will kind of offer an insight, and that we'll just kind of start taking it from there. An insight that kind of will help frame Brian's and my conversation. So let's start with an observation by Melvin Bray about a change that he found taking place in his own spiritual journey.
I was a teacher. I was on my first teaching assignment. And one day after school, I looked up and realized my classroom was the hangout for all the LGBT kids. They were all there, just rolled up on me in the afternoon. Hey, Mr. Bray, blah, 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 this, that, and the other thing. And what was amazing about that was I wasn't open and affirming at all. I had definite issues about, why people were gay. But in that moment, I believe the Spirit spoke to me and reminded me that 6 years prior, my stepfather, when I was going off to college, I was getting in the car to go off to college. Now, my stepfather was a fundamentalist. I mean, look, if God told you that you should live a sober life, my stepfather was the guy who believed that it was a sin to even enjoy himself at a good meal. I mean, this was the guy. But he, in this moment of surprising magnanimity, he walks up to me and he says, Melvin, if you're going to be a minister of the gospel of Jesus, you have to be willing to minister to everyone. And so I'm sitting there with those kids and I'm realizing I could interpret this as a chance to be a minister to those that I had previously kind of dismissed or whatever the case may be. But then the deeper realization came that no, I wasn't the minister in that moment. Those kids were ministering to me. And I was a recipient of a unique kind of grace that said, Mr. Bray, Mr. B, which is what they called me, even though you don't get it, we love you. And we're going to bring you into this, to an understanding that this love is for everyone.
Well, that sounds like a rock-solid principle, the Spirit talking too. At least in my life, it's over and over. You don't get it, we'll love you anyway. That's usually you don't get this. Yeah, I have actually a CD on my computer. Remind me of I picked up a CD by David White, the poet, recently, and on the inside cover, he's talking to a group of educators actually, and on the inside cover, he writes, "What you can plan is too small for you to live."
Wow.
What you can plan is too small for you to live. Hence the need for being thunderstruck. Break us out of those conventions that we build around ourselves. Melvin Bray, great guy. You see him often at Wild Goose festivals nowadays, a storyteller, and a lot of conferences around the country. Well, Brian, it's great to have you back on. As of this episode, you are now officially the most frequently featured Skype guest we've had on Darkwood Brew.
That's fantastic. Well, it's a big honor for me, and it tells you how much free time I have.
I don't think that's very much, actually, but you really get around all over the world.
Well, I'm a big believer in what you're doing, and so glad to be part of this with you.
Oh, well, thank you for joining us. So, Melvin, kind of in that video, I noticed a couple things, and I'm sure you have some thoughts on that too. But one of the things that really drew me to that video that Scott Grissell had picked out was the way his theology begins to shift in light of lived experience of finding common ground with other people who believed in him despite their differences of opinion.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say this really is this is part of life, isn't it? If we didn't have our perspectives expanded through life experience, I guess when we turn about 16 or 17, when we think we know everything, it would just be all a plateau from there.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it seems that a lot of what I see going on with Convergence Christianity, kind of these two streams that one had been associated more with the mainline, more liberal tradition, another with the more conservative evangelical tradition. In your article on pathos.com, you also recognize or pointing out, hey, there's also more people joining that stream from the progressive end of Catholicism, for instance, and what seems to be provoking some of this is people getting excited about aspects of their faith that they're finding in each other.
Yes.
That it's coming kind of from people who have left their native tradition, so they've kind of tried to shed some of the baggage, and when they just have less of the baggage and more of the gifts, they're saying, "Wow, I really appreciate that about you." I see your thirst for, a lot of the post-evangelicals are looking for something that has more commitments to social justice and non-literal readings of the Bible and so forth. They're seeing, oh, you guys have had this all along? What? Oh, I love that. And then those of us in the mainline church are looking at the post-evangelicals saying, wow, you've really got some really well-developed practices and commitments to daily prayer and Holy Spirit, those kinds of things. And it's kind of like one of those, you got your chocolate on my peanut butter, and my peanut butter your chocolate moments.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I remember years ago, I came across a book by a theologian and philosopher from Fuller Seminary named Nancy Murphy, and it was called Beyond Liberalism and Fundamentalism. And Nancy points out that historically, there were two responses to modernity, two responses to the Enlightenment project. One was the response of conservatism or fundamentalism, and the other was the response of liberalism. And I personally think that part of what's happened in the last several decades is that the modern project itself that we were all reacting to in two different ways, that project itself has run aground in some ways and come to the end of its chapter. And so now, those of us who defined ourselves in different ways toward the same reality of the Enlightenment, now we're having to face new realities together. And I think part of it is just as you say, it's like peanut butter and chocolate coming together. But another part of it, it's like a couple that I performed their wedding for years ago. And the husband had multiple sclerosis. And had a degenerative physical condition, but was one of the most upbeat, positive, inspiring human beings you've ever met. And the bride, she was physically in great shape, but she suffered from depression. And, you saw their two needs bring them together. And I think that's part of what brings us together, too, from this liberal background and conservative background. It's not just strengths that we bring, but also needs that we bring.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And I know a lot in my own tribe of the mainline church, a lot of the transformation that's gone on in the last 20 years has been through actually embracing the kind of the pain, and the mainline church has suffered a fair amount of decline over that period and so forth, and what that's provoked is a lot of soul searching and a lot of re-asking, are we just kind of going to continue doing the same old thing, expecting different results? And maybe the problems, originally we blamed society, we're just being too prophetic, and people are getting uncomfortable. Well, there's always a part of that, but eventually we started saying, well, maybe the problem's with us too.
Yeah.
We need to look at that, and in the process, a lot of the mainliners really discovered their roots and their own spiritual path in that, so, to the point where now when I go out, and I'd be curious to know what your experience is, but when I go out to these conferences amongst mainliners, I see just an incredible spiritedness and an incredible joy that was not the case. Even 5-6 years ago.
Yeah, and one of the ironies of this is that conservatives are conservative theologically, but they've been very flexible, you could say hyper-progressive methodologically.
That's right. Yeah.
Meanwhile, the folks who are very liberal theologically very often were hyper-rigid and conservative methodologically. So once again, we come with opposite strengths, opposite weaknesses, and we have a lot. Well, in one sense, we have a lot to learn from each other, but in another sense, we have an awful lot to admit together. We don't have a clue of what's going on, and in a sense, we have to set out into new territory together. I often think of a quote from a Roman Catholic missionary named Vincent Donovan, who wrote a fantastic book called Christianity Rediscovered. And here's what Vincent Donovan said. He said, "Do not try to bring others to where you are, as beautiful as that place might be, but instead go with others to a place neither you nor they have ever been before." And I think that's our opportunity for those of us coming from these different backgrounds. We are called, I believe, and being led by the Spirit into new territory we've never been before.
That's a very good point, Brian. I couldn't agree with you more. I think, in fact, one of the dangers as we continue is the Convergence Christianity conversation continues, out beyond this place, is that there can be, if you're not really careful, there can be a way people can interpret this as simply a coming together of conservatism and liberalism into some weird hybrid, and that's just not it. It is truly both camps kind of moving beyond themselves into that third place that you're talking about.
And I don't know if you find this to be true among more traditional liberal folks, but among a lot of my evangelical friends, the world is so binary. You're either evangelical or you're liberal. You're either conservative or you're liberal. And so as soon as I and others like me depart a little bit from their viewpoint, their only term for us is liberal. And I think that dualistic way of seeing things is a huge part of the problem.
Yeah. That's fascinating. If I could just jump in for a second, because in my end of the theological swimming pool or my native area, it's the exact opposite. That everything is all open and not defined. And if you start defining yourself, and especially if you start grasping hold of one particular tradition, then you're defined as conservative.
Yes.
So it's two different, same thing going on in two different ways.
That's right. And this, I think, is our great opportunity. And that's what convergence can be about. It's when we start to see, there are strengths and weaknesses of conservatives, strengths and weaknesses of traditional liberals. And now here we are trying to learn from both the strengths and the weaknesses. And we're facing the new challenges and new questions that are being raised. And we realize, let me say it this way, as I face the challenges of the 21st century as a Christian, look, I need all the help I can get. And I want everybody at the table who can be there to bring some resources. Protestants, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Western Christians, people from the global North, people from the global South, the traditional, the European-rooted traditions, and the Latin American, African, Asian-rooted traditions. We need everybody at the table we can get. And that's what you mentioned, Phyllis Tickle's new book. One of the characteristics of this emergence is that it tries to transcend and include these old polarities. And that's why emergence and convergence really go together.
Yeah. When you see that kind of convergence point, not that any of us can really define that overly, because not everybody believes alike. In fact, that's one of the things I think that's a characteristics of the convergence, that we don't all agree on everything.
Yes.
But as you see that third place to where both kind of those streams, or though all those streams are tending to head, what does that look like to you?
Well, I think if we can speak of the strengths that we bring from each tradition, from the liberal tradition, I think we bring an openness to science, an openness to critical thought. In many ways, the liberal Protestant community has been the community that has most courageously waded into the realm of critical thought. Philosophers who talk about this say there is a critical phase. There is a pre-critical phase. That's where we all came from. Then there's a critical phase. But then there is a post-critical phrase. They often call it the second naivete. And I think, but you can't get to that second naivete until you've gone, in a sense, from your pre-critical down to the bottom in your critical, and then you can begin to resurrect into the second naivete, the second freshness, this new vision. I think liberal Protestants help us with that. They weren't afraid to ask the tough questions. They weren't afraid to ask critical questions about the Bible. And you know what? On the way down, they may have developed somewhat of a cynicism in many cases. Or I heard one person say it like this, that in the Enlightenment, we exorcised one ghost too many, the Holy Ghost. And what happened is, in trying to get rid of superstition and this sort of pre-critical naivete, in some ways we started, maybe in many cases, we wrote off too much. So that's a huge strength now that the folks who've been through that process, and now, as you say, I see it everywhere I go in mainline Protestant settings. Most mainline Protestants I'm around have already hit bottom, and they're really trying to envision a new future. And there's a wonderful spiritual rediscovery. I'll get to that in a minute. From the evangelicals, evangelicals really emphasized personal experience of God, personal commitment, personal growth, and they also emphasize that we have good news to share with the world. Oh, those are fantastic strengths from an evangelical background. Sadly, evangelicals have had several decades of where they felt they were at the top of the pile, so to speak, especially because of their political influence, especially in the Republican Party. That I think a lot of evangelicals are in a bit of, they're sort of addicted to power right now, and they're on a bit of a power high. And they, and I hate to say it, but a kind of pride comes along with that sometimes. And so evangelicals are having to cope with all that, but they're enormous strengths. Another great thing about evangelicals, as I said before, they were very innovative with things like new technology. So in an interesting way, Darkwood Brew is a very evangelical thing to do, in the sense you believe we have a message and we have hope that we should get into new media and get out to other people. I think that's a fantastic thing. But I want to add, I think the progressive Catholics are bringing something very important to the table, because like mainline Protestants, they have an emphasis on social justice, a concern for the environment, a concern for peace, concern for poverty. But they also bring back the mystical tradition, the contemplative tradition. Right. And again, you illustrate this in Darkwood Brew by taking that ancient practice of Lectio Divina. And I think this is an essential part of this. I think it was the Catholic theologian Karl Rahner who said that the Christian of the future will be a mystic, or there won't be a Christian at all. And what he meant by that isn't somebody sort of out in outer space, but he meant that people will take seriously the contemplative dimension, the experience of God in stillness and quietness. So I think at least those elements have to come together. Could I add one more real quick?
Absolutely.
I also think that those of us from the global north and those of us from European descent really have to pay attention. An essential part of this convergence is to hear the ethnic minority voices, Black theology, Latino theology, and for white males, feminist theology. But we really need to hear indigenous theology, the insights that come to us from our Native American brothers and sisters and indigenous people around the world. And then we have got to hear authentic African theology, authentic Latin American, Asian theology. And that is all part of the convergence too.
Yeah. Well, and if the Spirit is kind of behind this, as you're suggesting, that's got a good track record for diversity and welcoming diverse expressions. Think of first time that happened on Pentecost Sunday. Yeah.
In fact, when you were saying that we weren't going to have time today for a meditation on Scripture, if I could just offer one.
You bet.
I'm thinking about that passage in 1 Corinthians 12 where the Apostle Paul talks about that we're all together the body of Christ. And I'm going to adapt what he said, but I think this is apropos. We could say the evangelical cannot say to the mainline Protestant or the Catholic, because you are not evangelical, you are not part of the body. The white Christian cannot say to the poor Christian from Africa or Latin America, because you are not wealthy and middle class and educated like me, you are not part of the body. No, the fact is, very often the parts of the body that seem most disadvantaged actually have the greatest blessings to bring all of us, and that's an essential part of this convergence. If it doesn't comprise that span of diversity, I don't think we'll be anywhere close to fulfilling the potential that is there and to meeting the needs of the decades ahead.
Absolutely. Well, and actually, that we will be kind of upping that ante in that realm in the conversation shortly. We want to take a break and hear from Diana Butler Bass, and that will actually set us up for talking about wider implications in church life and well beyond. Let's take a look at what Diana Butler Bass had a few months ago on Darkwood Brew.
Diana, in your book, you reference a global community based on shared connection. And here's a question. What do you both see as the role of church leadership in this global community based on shared connection that you've alluded to?
Wow. Good question.
Oh dear, some bishop has popped in.
Everything you can say can and will be used against you in the ecclesiastical court of law. Is that what you're playing?
We got your back, Diana.
Yeah, we got your back.
One of the things that I think is really powerful about this awakening is that it's an awakening of the people. And that means that leaders are going to have to understand that they are part of a community, not above a community, and that they're not causing the awakening, but instead they can be nurturing or fostering understandings of awakening in all of the communities and the relationships around them. Is that leadership in the 21st century is embedded in the power of the people to be connected with one another. And leadership is going to look much more like Occupy Wall Street in the future than it's going to look like the old traditional chain of being from the medieval church or from the modern church. And so there's going to be a role for leadership. There has to be a role for leadership, but it's going to be leadership that's linked and decentralized and embedded in community instead of above, beyond community.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that just the nature of what we're doing with Darkwood Brew is kind of reflective of what our answer to the question
Absolutely.
is. That every major revolution in Christianity has been accompanied by a major technological change in terms of communication, and I think we have undervalued and underestimated the power of the internet in shaping the revolution or the awakening here, and the fact that we can actually not just simply try to broadcast our quote-unquote wisdom out to y'all, but actually create something that is an interactive thing where our viewers are actually participants in this, and not only feeding back during the program, but feeding out back during the week via Facebook and so forth, so that actually our own community becomes the leadership shaping the very content of Darkwood Brew, which then gets transformed into small group DVDs, so that whose purpose is not to, again, broadcast our wisdom out to small groups, but actually to stimulate discussion amongst the small group people themselves, realizing that the power is in those relationships in the small groups, and that we're just simply helping to foster that communication. And then as they get more involved, they become more active in the creation of the Darkwood Brew live broadcast, and so it just becomes this amazing feedback loop and synergistic loop where we're all becoming the creators of content together. It feels like a living, breathing organism rather than that old kind of steeple thing, and here's the top and there's the bottom. Yeah.
Just to finish up the thought, Eric, is that part of the thing that happens is that Christians, when they're looking for an awakening, they look for a single individual. Where's our Martin Luther, or where's our George Whitefield, or where's our John Wesley, or whatever? And this awakening is not that. We are Martin Luther.
Right.
Every single person has the possibility of being the person who starts the awakening in their own community, in their own set of relationships, in their own place. And so there is not one Luther, there's millions, which is, like, to me, so amazing. And it makes it very different from awakenings in the past. And that's one of the things that I try to communicate, that energy and that passion and the risk and the fact that this is something we're all sharing as we move into the 21st century. With all the ends, we really have a new beginning. And if we do it well, we can transform the world. And I'm very excited that that is really within our grasp.
Yeah.
But we will have to do it. We have to do it. We can't sit around and just sort of wait for some great theologian to arrive on the scene and fix it for us.
All right. Always full of wisdom, Diana Butler-Bass. Well, Brian, I want to maybe spring from that, what Diana Butler-Bass was talking about, and kind of also what you were talking about at the tail end of our last segment about how we all kind of get along together. There was a comment or question came in on the live chat from a mainline minister in Des Moines, Iowa, who asks, what do liberals have to give up in order to see convergence happen with conservatives or convergence conservatives? I wonder if maybe that could jump us off into a conversation about the implications for the wider church.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the first thing we'd have to say, obviously, is that there's a wide range of people under that umbrella liberal. But maybe I could make two comments, and then you might have something you'd want to say about that, Eric. But the first thing I would say that has to happen on both sides is we have to give up our hostility toward the other. I have a book coming out in a couple of weeks. It's about Christian identity in a multi-faith world, and it's especially about the identity of Christians in relation to Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, Hindus, and so on. But it also has to do, often our harshest animosities aren't with people of other faiths, they're people with another version of our own faith. And we define ourselves by who we're against. We define ourselves by our hostilities. And for us to say, I have defined myself for years, decades, my whole life by a certain set of hostilities, I'm ready now to try to move beyond that kind of self-definition. I think that's essential. But I think a second thing that a lot of, quote, mainline Protestants from a liberal tradition are going to have to come to terms with. They're going to have to do some rethinking about institutions and movements. You might say it like this. For the last 30 or 40 years, evangelicals have been a movement, and they have been knocking on the door of religious institutions. In some cases, such as with the Southern Baptists, they had takeovers of institutions, and then that became an institutional base from which they worked. But I really like what Diana said, that in the way forward, we have to think more like Occupy Wall Street. I think whatever this emergence and convergence is, in the short run, it's got to be more of a movement. Eventually, it will have its effect on institutions, but that will be a challenge, I think a bigger challenge for quote, liberal Protestants, because they're so accustomed to thinking institutionally.
Right, yeah. You know, I'm reminded of a parable that Jim Forbes told a few years ago, back in 2006, when some of us with Crosswalk America were walking across the country to kind of proclaim that Christianity is more than what you see on television. And we were walking to the banner of what we called progressive Christianity at the time. We didn't like the term progressive, but it was the only term that was out there that anybody recognized that meant maybe it's not liberal, maybe it's not conservative, it's something else.
Yes.
And so we said, okay, we're progressive. But he came and preached at the very beginning of that walk and told the parable of the prodigal son. And he told it from a direction that I don't know if any of us had ever heard, because in the more liberal mainline church, we're used to be painted by those who are on the other side of the theological swimming pool as being, if you're going to put us in that parable, we're the prodigal that has been feasting with the pigs in the far country and needs to come back. But Jim Forbes actually turned that whole parable around and had us look at it from this perspective, in the sense that he said, eventually people on that other side of the tradition are going to recognize that there are some gifts that the liberal tradition has been bearing with it that they haven't seen. And there have been other ways in which that tradition, the more evangelical conservative tradition, has been in the far country. Now, you can also reverse this. So I'm just going to say it how he said it, but you can also say it from the other angle. But he said, when they wake up and realize this, that they've been in the far country, you guys are going to have to be careful. We're all going to have to be careful, because the biggest danger is it will be like that elder brother. And we'll be saying, well, we've been towing the line the whole time, and we've been holding firm, and our churches have been declining while you guys are doing this. And you can even feel that sometimes, like, for instance, when Rob Bell's book came out about salvation, and which was really talking about a very mainline understanding of salvation, but his book was going through the roof and getting all this attention, and you could already feel mainline ministers saying, well, gee, we've been doing this all along, and they just come lately. It's like there's the elder brother, and we all have to kind of, as you're saying, in a sense, swallow our own egos.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And as you say, it's a problem on both sides. And part of this, we have to be compassionate with people. Mainline Protestants feel they have been faithful while these crazy fundamentalists and charismatics and Pentecostals and evangelicals have been doing all this crazy mischief. We've been faithful. We've hung in there. Meanwhile, evangelicals and charismatics, they all think we've been faithful while those crazy mainline Protestants have been doing all this crazy stuff. Yep. And each one is feeling how they've been faithful. And something I've only experienced one side of this, but I believe people have experienced both sides. People have been wounded by their counterparts. There are lots of evangelicals who've been insulted and demeaned and excluded, and they what they feel they've experienced at the hands of liberals is insulting and harmful and hurtful, and vice versa. There have been a lot of liberals who've just been put down and judged and treated shabbily by conservatives. And we've got to come to terms with our pain on both sides of that. And we got to move beyond it too. We've got to forgive each other and move forward, because and I know you would agree with this, Eric. I think our world is in deep. I'm looking for the right word, trouble, and we've got to bring the resources of our faith to bear on the crisis of the planet, the crisis of poverty, the crisis of peace, and the crisis of religion. And that's going to take us all working together, all of us who aren't just battening down the hatches and circling the wagons. We've got to come together. We've got a lot of work to do. Yeah, no, I agree. There's definitely been a lot of pain on both sides. I was just in Atlanta last week speaking to a group of about 200, primarily mainline ministers, but there were some evangelical folks present as well, and opening up a conversation on convergence. And what really gratified me actually was I did not run into that elder brother energy amongst the mainliners. They were actually saying, this is really hopeful, and they were also saying, this is what we're seeing, but we just haven't had the words to describe it, and very excited to welcome in people who they used to consider not their friends. But as we had a breakout session of about 30 to 40 of us, and that was attended primarily by the mainliners, but there were a couple of evangelicals there, and the mainliners were expressing all this excitement about welcoming in their brothers and sisters and coming together, but they were also with the couple of people who were in the evangelical tradition. We were talking later, and they said, I had no idea how much pain is in the mainline church over what has gone on in the other side. You're right, there's pain on both sides, but if we don't get over it, I think we're in for a lot more pain, because as you're saying, we are in deep doo-doo if we don't get over that. That's it exactly, and that's what makes this very exciting. And Eric, that's the fact that at a place like Darkwood Brew, you're bringing together people from across the spectrum, and we're listening to each other, and behind the scenes we're becoming friends. And I'm a huge believer in the power of friendship, and And we're realizing we do need each other, and the fact is we've all been through a lot. You are not a traditional 1950s or 1960s style liberal. I'm not a traditional 1960s or 1970s style evangelical. We're something else, and we're acknowledging that we really are on the same journey together. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's exciting.
I love what you say about the friendship too. I think that as this builds its way out, my hope is that we'll actually, those of us who come from the mainline church will take a cue from the evangelical church. And it seems like whenever something happens, we want to instantly form a committee and then create an institution as quickly as possible. Yeah. And we really have tended to devalue the power of friendships in creation of anything real and substantial. I would love to see a convergence network of people and organizations emerge that are primarily founded on friendships, on relationship, and just say, let's just get together and form and see if there's a friendship to be formed, and trust that if there is, the work of the church or whatever will come from it. We don't know what that will be, but we trust the friendship will develop whatever needs to develop. And not, instead of just saying, let's get a bunch of people together so we can figure out who's going to do what and who's going to make what and so forth.
And that's a messy process, and it can't be rushed, but it is absolutely essential. Could I just tell a quick story about this? I was in an evangelical setting, I guess it was 5 or 6 years ago, speaking to a group of evangelical leaders, and there was a fellow there who treated me about as rudely as I've ever been treated to my face. I mean, I've had a few behind my back, but in terms of something that was extremely uncomfortable, people in the room were crying because I'd been so badly treated. And this fella just was out to humiliate me and drive me from the field, so to speak. And I was completely taken aback by it. And I must admit, it hurt. And it was clear he wanted to win and wanted me to lose, and I was an evil person in his mind who needed to be vanquished. Well, I guess it was about a year and a half ago. I happened to be in a meeting with this same fellow again. And there were maybe 10 or 15 people in the room. But he told a story about a big failure in his life and a big disruption in his family's life. And he shared very vulnerably. And he said, in the last couple of years, I've had to experience what it feels like to be on the side of the sinner and the loser and the failure. I'd never experienced that before. He says, it's really changed me. And he looked across the room, and for a brief second, our eyes made contact. And I knew that was his way of saying to me, I'm sorry. And we met one another on the level of humanity and vulnerability. And I just think that there's a lot of that's going to have to happen.
Absolutely. What do you think if for the viewers, we have a lot of actually Christian clergy who tune into Darkwood Brew. That was another big surprise to us, how many clergy tune in and use this as their own worship, because they're leading worship on Sunday mornings. But if you were a clergy person, and either from a mainline church or an evangelical church, or maybe it's just an unaffiliated Bible church, and you're thinking, this convergence thing's kind of interesting. I want to deliberately, I think we're operating convergence mode. I want to get the word out to those who aren't like me or haven't been like me. Do you have any insight or wisdom about that?
Well, I think there are many levels where that has to happen. One level is people need to find each other and find some space to have a conversation. So emergentvillage.com was one of the great services that they did. They've helped people find each other to establish cohorts. And these cohorts basically were just a place people often met in a bar or a restaurant or something, but they would just get together and they would talk. And they'd say, hey, let's read this book by Diana Butler Bass and talk about it. And what that did is it gave them a chance to converge, and to find some safe places to talk. But I'll tell you something we really need, and you and I have talked about this. We need a place for whatever this thing is that's emerging and converging to get the word out to people who have been driven out of their existing churches. When I say driven out, I don't mean anybody was there with a gun or anything, but they were evangelicals who asked too many questions. They were evangelicals who changed their view toward LGBT people. They were evangelicals who decided that they thought evolution was one of God's coolest creations. They were evangelicals who, they decided to not vote for a Republican, whatever it is, And simultaneously, there are mainline Protestants who have had one committee meeting too many.
Absolutely.
It's pushed.
I have an amen in the coffee house.
and they have gotten so sick of this tradition and hidebound, way of thinking, and they've actually maybe every once in a while wanted to say hallelujah, or be joyful or something, and anyway, people who just feel a need for more fresh air and space. And we need to get the word out that there are churches, and some of them will be Lutheran, and some will be UCC, and some will be non-denominational, and some will be whatever, But we need to get the word out, because I get emails, I would say anywhere from 3 or 4 to 10 a month of people say, hey, I live in Omaha. Can you tell me about a church that would accept somebody like me? Well, fortunately, if it's Omaha, I can. But there are a lot of places where I don't think they don't have many hospitable places, any place close by. We have to get the word out that these places exist. And those places have to understand that there are people dying to find a safe space like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. You raised some good points there. On that level, just from what you were talking about a few seconds ago, there's some interesting statistics that have suggested over time that there's a kind of a minority population in both sides of that theological swimming pool of liberalism and conservatism that really do have a lot of common ground. I think that's where a lot of these folks are coming from, and for a mainline liberal minister or parishioner to hear some statistics about their fundamentalist brothers and sisters, it's kind of shocking, actually, and vice versa. I'll just put up a couple of these on the screen that I was sharing at the conference last week. For instance, 5 in every 8, or 5 to 8 rather, of every 10 evangelical Protestants, depending on which poll you pay attention to, and these have gone on for years, believe that people of religions other than Christianity can go to heaven. 5 to 8 in every 10. 4 in every 10 evangelical Protestants believe that the Bible is not the literal Word of God. One of these believes that the Bible is written by human beings, not God. And I'm just kind of pointing out some of these things. They challenge what we normally think of evangelicals. Not everybody will necessarily agree with these, but they challenge the thought. 5 in every 10 evangelical Protestants believe there is more than one true way to interpret the teachings of their faith. 3 in every 10 evangelical Protestants are either affiliated with the Democratic Party or lean Democratic. Now, I don't put that up there to promote the Democratic Party as the way to go or anything like that, but it's just simply, again, it's to challenge the conventional thinking about evangelical Christians. 3 in every 10 evangelical Protestants believe that abortion should be legal in all or most circumstances. Again, it challenges the notion of what is an evangelical Christian. 3 in every 10 evangelical Protestants believe, I can't read it on the screen here, climate change, yes, is the result of human activity. And coupled with that, 5 in every 10 believe that stricter environmental laws and regulations are worth the cost. 8 in every 10 evangelical Protestants disagree with the statement that women should return to their traditional roles in society. Between 1988 and 2010, opposition to gay marriage among, quote, born-again Christians shrank from 9 in 10 to 6 in 10. And finally, 3 in every 10 evangelical Protestants affirm belief in evolution. I think that actually has grown since that statistic first came out. But I just simply bring those up to challenge the notions of what mainliners think about Protestantism. And you can do the same thing with liberalism, too. You can see that 5 in every 10 mainline Protestants believe that religion is very important in one's life. That was, they got the choice of important, but they chose very important. 7 in every 10 mainline Protestants pray weekly. 5 pray in every 10 pray daily. That is higher in the evangelical church, but notice that there's 5 mainliners who are praying daily, and 3 in 10 mainline Protestants report receiving answers to prayer at least once or twice a month, and some also once a week. And finally, a recent study that Diana Butler Bass cited from Hartford Institute for Religion Research discovered that liberal congregations actually display higher levels of spiritual vitality than do conservative ones, noting that these findings were, quote, counterintuitive to the usual narrative of American church life. That's not to say that all liberal churches are vital and more vital than conservatives. What they were noticing, as I read the statistics a little bit more deeply, was that if you look at the far end of that liberal paradigm, as best as we can describe it, they actually found far more signs of this vital spiritual life than they were expecting, and I think those are churches that are kind of moving into this convergence mode. So, lots of food for thought, I think.
That's extremely helpful and encouraging. I think you're right. It reminds us that these labels are just fitting less and less. They just don't describe reality nearly as well as some people would like them to. And we have to remember there are an awful lot of conservatives who like things just the way they are, or maybe the way they were a few years ago, and they aren't going to change anytime soon. We aren't talking about a convergence that's sweeping, across the world. And there are a lot of mainline Protestants. If they get their organ music and if they get, their checklist of their liturgy, that's all they want. Don't mess with anything else, So there are a lot of folks who are very happy with the way things have been. But you and I and thousands of us connected through Darkwood Brew, we see that the times they are changing and that something's going on, and we believe it's the Spirit of God, and we want to encourage other folks who are about to give up, not to give up, but that we think this is the beginning of something very hopeful and promising. We look back in church history and we see this sort of thing has happened again and again. Diana Butler Bass talks about that as a church historian. And so we have a lot of reason for hope.
Absolutely. Well, we want to give people a chance to digest this a little bit and ask and now solicit feedback also from our Darkwood Brew viewership. We're going to go to our the Brews Brothers. That's our house band with Darkwood Brew for a few moments, and then we're going to step into a clip from Frank Schaefer. Frank Schaefer, who I've mentioned on this broadcast, I considered Frank an enemy of mine back in the 80s and 90s. He didn't know me, otherwise he would have considered me an enemy of his too. We're now great friends. And that's not simply because Frank has changed, but it's also because I've changed, and we found our friendship at that convergence point. So we're going to hear from Frank, and then back with your questions. So if you're on live chat, we encourage you now to type them in as we reflect musically as well. What do you have for us, Matt?
Well, joining Carlos and Steve and I, we have Matt Amandus and Jorge Nila on the saxophone, and this is a Chuck Moronic composition entitled "These Are the Times."
Simon steps out of the boat and gets a few feet just fine, but then realizes where he is and what's happening and sinks like a rock.
So the Dalai Lama walks into a pizza shop and says, "Can you make me one with everything?"
What's that? What's that?
Oh, I knew that wouldn't work.
I noticed that I'm on the night that's discussing failures, so I'm kind of wondering if you're trying to make a point. So, genuinely, you thank God for the failures in your life, and you kind of look at the path you would have been on if your best laid plans had worked out. And I'm always thankful for the things that don't work out, almost more for than the things that do. Why would I for a minute put hope in my own correct ideas about anything, instead of rather hope in looking into the eyes of this little 3.5-year-old girl and realizing what I see reflected there is the fundamental truth of the universe, and that is it's a two-way unconditional love between a grandfather and his little granddaughter. If that's not what this is all about, then we're all lost.
Peter was a very different person when he got back into the boat. You never get into the same boat once you've gotten out of it to follow Spirit, once you've gotten out of it to follow this great love. When you go out there, when you take a step on that water, whether you sink or you dance, you have succeeded. Well, before we go any further, I want to also mention for those of you who may be just joining us for the first time this evening that at the end of Darkwood Brew, we always offer communion. I may think that's a bit odd to be sharing communion online, but we do invite our Darkwood Brew viewer participants to gather bread and wine or juice and crackers or whatever you have there and share a common meal with you if that fits within your understanding of faith. And we respect it if you don't, but we want to offer you that invitation at the end of our episode this evening. So, well, Morris, you as our social media director extraordinaire and Chris have been monitoring the chat this evening, and what have you found?
Lots of discussion. I mean, just amazing discussion, depth of discussion. Let me crystallize this into one question. I will frame it in the following manner. Questions have ranged. If two become one, what do they become? Types of comments. Hall & Oates, yes.
A Hall & Oates song. They're becoming a Hall & Oates song. There. Next question?
Next framing. What does Convergence Christianity mean for religious doctrine, political behavior, and commitment of these organizations? That's a framing question. And here's the specific question that I'd like for you and Brian to answer. Any advice for an emerging post-crisis lay leader in a small conservative church? Quote, our beliefs don't line up anymore. I still have a desire to teach. How can we sustain LGBT discussions? Does one have to leave their environment in order to sustain these dialogues?
So a person in a small, rural, conservative, or I don't know if it was rural or not, but conservative church, a leader in that church.
Yes.
What do I do if maybe my views have moved in one direction and theirs are in another area?
Yes.
Okay.
Any advice?
Well, I'd be happy to let Brian take the first step.
I don't know whether to say you're a very humble man or a very wise man or a very tricky man.
Yes.
Well, first of all, there are way too many variables to be able to give safe advice in a situation like this, but a couple of things I'd say. First, I think a pastor in that setting first needs to assess whether the leaders of the church are with the pastor and moving with the pastor or not. If they're not, I think the pastor makes a big mistake to try to bring the congregation along before bringing the lay leaders along. And so you can't skip that step. You have to go through a process with your leaders. If your leaders are not moving at a very fast pace, then I think the pastor has to ask a question like this. Will the leaders allow me on my own time to have ministry that's not on the church clock, so to speak? So I think that's a question that you can get an answer to. I think there are a lot of pastors who couldn't get away with things that would be done in the church on a Sunday morning, but that pastor has a lot more power and a lot more freedom around his own dining room table on a Tuesday night or a Saturday night or something, where a lot of creative ministry could happen. And I would encourage a pastor to use that freedom if they don't have it on a Sunday. Sometimes if that starts to develop, that will later lead to a crisis. But that would be a wonderful problem to have two vital things going, one that you're getting paid for and one that you're not getting paid for. I think that might open up some creative space.
Yeah,
I'm wondering if you reverse the roles, and in this particular case, he was a lay leader in his church, not the pastor. So what happens if we reverse the roles and it's the lay leaders that want to move in a specific direction and it's the pastor who's not quite there yet? What happens then? Where's the advice on that?
Yeah. My first thought is I wish that were more common. But it does, you're right, it does happen. And I think there are times where the congregation needs to say to the pastor, look, the leaders need to say, we feel the Spirit is leading us in this direction. Can you go with us? And if the pastor says no, then I think they can say, well, this might be a good time for us to think about a different arrangement for the future. And I think that should be done graciously and kindly and patiently. But then again, there might be other creative possibilities where the congregation can say, well, we have a lot of people who like the kind of leadership that our current pastor is offering, but we need to create some new space. And I'm all for bringing change by addition rather than change by substitution. Create new space for something new to happen, and don't destroy the old that's working quite well.
Yeah, if I could kind of spring from that, there actually is more of that what Chris is suggesting than maybe is evident on the surface of things happening. We regularly run into people who are like that. They may not actually be theologically more progressive or in this mode or convergence mode than their minister, but they are more than the minister is willing to say from the pulpit.
Yes.
And this is deeply frustrating to them. And so even as back in 2006, one of the things we noticed as we walk across the country was the emergence of these house churches or house gatherings that we were used to seeing house churches formed because the group was more conservative than their local church. These were house gatherings. They were more liberal than their local church. Even though their ministers may have been right there theologically with them, they were so frustrated that they never got to really talk about that. They all had to be undercover that they finally said, well, we need to form a community where we can just be ourselves, and talk. In fact, Darkwood Brew has viewerships. We're aware of people who are using Darkwood Brew as that gathering point. And there's a town, I won't mention the town because the ministers in those towns may be watching, but where literally there's about 5 groups from 5 different churches who are gathering to watch Darkwood Brew episodes because they're not having that itch scratched, even though their ministers may be very much on board with them. So that is definitely happening.
And I think one of the keys to Convergence Christianity in this particular sense is that you don't have to leave your community in order to have these conversations. I think that's the biggest fear. You've got relationships and you've got friendships that we were talking about that are already formed in the communities that you're in, and even though you're starting to think and question and discern in maybe different ways, you can have those conversations without having to leave your community.
Yeah. I was struck by a conversation I once had with Bishop John Shelby Spong, or Jack Spong, once, who was kind of asking about his own kind of path, and he said that he acknowledged, of course, that he can be kind of he can really be a polarizer at times, but he said, that part of that is my intentional part of my own vocational understandings, that I can provide cover for people who may not be as liberal as I am, but maybe but intrigued by what is happening, and they can start speaking more liberally, and they can say, well, I'm no Spong, but I think we ought to. I thought that raised an interesting point that sometimes a third entity, whether you be a layperson in a congregation want to lead or a minister, if you bring in a third entity, whether that be a Darkwood Brew or Living the Questions or Animate, is now creating curriculum and so forth, that's pretty interesting. As that third piece, then it's a bit less removed, and you can start saying, well, maybe I don't agree with all this, but I think they're worth listening to. That kind of thing.
I think all the pastors listening will agree. It's a nice situation for a pastor to be in the position of moderator, trying to make sure everybody's voice is heard, rather than in the position of defender or offender, if I can say it that way. So that's true, and so I think this is an extremely productive question to ask. And I just go back again to Diana Butler Bass's point. When she said that everybody's looking for the Martin Luther, we have to understand we are all the Martin Luther, and we all have a role to play in this. I love the way an African, one of my African mentors said it to me. He said, we need the courage to differ graciously. And he said all three words are essential: courage, differ, and graciously.
That's beautiful. Yeah. One other thing, I'm reminded of a person who became a hero figure for me early on in my ministry, named Ben Guess. He was actually now serves as the local church ministries officer of the United Church of Christ. But back in the day, I was just starting out. I had a congregation of 25 members in Closter, New Jersey, as I was finishing up my doctorate at Princeton, and kind of wondering where this was all headed. And there was an article that came out in the United Church of Christ newspaper about how there's this upstart minister in Hendrickson, Kentucky, of all places, who had taken a 20-person church, all above the age of 80, and had turned it in a couple of years' time into a 200-member church, doing church in a very radically new mode, and yet without alienating a single one of those 80-year-old members. And I was like, whoa, I need to get on the phone and find this Ben Guest guy. And I talked to him, and I asked him how he did that. And one of the things that became very clear was he loved those 80-year-old members dearly. He was their pastor. He had nurtured. He had really had that relational cachet to allow some flexibility. So he was really their pastor. He really loved them. And the second thing he did is just what you said, Brian, is he then went out into the community. He went to bars. He invited people to his church and so forth, and talking about this. Well, back then it was a progressive. He talked about this really progressive church that he was into, even before it was progressive. But he started rounding up a community of people outside the church who then came into the church, and just little by little the church grew in little pockets by little pockets who were attracted to that. And then finally he said, in Hendrickson, there's probably only 5% of the whole town in this conservative area that would want anything to do with what we're doing. 5%. But Hendrickson, Kentucky has a population of 350,000 people. I'll take 5%.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's helpful, especially for those of us who have the benefit of being in a larger, more metropolitan context, is you don't have to be all things to all people.
That's right.
Be yourself and get that word out, and then even if it's 2% or 3% or 5% in a large population anyway, you can do that. You have another question?
A lot of other questions. One of the other issues that's resurfacing now is the concept of the institution following the Spirit, or should the institution be a representative of the Spirit, or should the individuals, or should it be a representative of doctrine? People are concerned about, or the people in the online community are concerned about having a spirit that does not match with church doctrine. And what is the role of this institution? Should this institution be guiding spirit, or should this institution be guiding doctrine?
Or should it be guiding either one?
Or either one.
Okay. Well, Brian, you want to take that one?
Under the bus.
It's the benefit of being a host.
Online. These are the questions.
I think we'll finish up with this question too.
First, it's a fantastic question, and it deserves many more episodes of Darkwood Brew to grapple with this. But I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and in fact, somewhere down the road, I think I'll do some writing about this. But I think we need a theology of movements and institutions. And let me give just a quick definition that will be enough to get people thinking. I would define an institution as a human organization that preserves the gains made by past social movements. And I would define a movement as a human organization that proposes gains to current institutions. So the two are always in relationship with each other. Institutions aren't bad, institutions aren't good. Bad institutions are bad, good institutions are good. Bad movements are bad, good movements are good. And we need to see their dynamic interaction. And if we can do that, I think that will save us from repeating a lot of mistakes in our past, especially us Protestants. What we Protestants tend to do is whenever we have a quarrel with our denomination, we split and go form the pure one, And we have a lot to learn from our mistakes in that regard. But we need to get more savvy about both movements and institutions.
Yeah, good point. I wrote an article a while back entitled Heady Heterodoxy that was actually springing from an insight that Karen Ward in Seattle had once said. She kind of laid out a beer brewing theology for me that I thought was very insightful. And she talked about how in German beer brewing, they have quite a rigid system. There's 4 ingredients. There's like barley, malt, hops, and water, and then you got the yeast. And they solidified that, they codified that back in like the 16th century, and it's the German purity law. And so consequently, you can have some great beers brewed with highly consistent quality, but rarely do you get into the heights of joy in a German beer. You're always going to get a good one, but not necessarily the heights. She said, now you go over to Belgium, and they'll throw anything into a vat to see if it works. Just about anything. And they have this passion, this spirit about the beer brewing. And so what they do is if it tastes good, then they'll start to use it. If it doesn't, then they go on. Consequently, Belgium has some of the worst beers in the world.
They do.
But they also have some of the very, 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 very best beers in the world. And I think that in some ways, Christianity needs kind of a heady heterodoxy. Those who are willing to go out and throw in the skanky cat or whatever it is into the vat and see if that brews anything and recognize. Well, okay, I don't mean to offend any PETA. I'm sorry, I'm going to get a million letters from PETA now. Who swims anyway? Okay. Reese's peanut butter cups into the beer. Who try that and have the freedom to fail, or like Peter, step out of the boat and have the freedom to sink. But when those things are found that really resonate, that really kind of catch the edge of that spirit, and that's where we truly do need institutions. As much as people talk about, I don't like the institutional church and so forth. Well, I would ask anybody who says that. I have my own problems with the institutional church, but ultimately, love wants to be organized.
Yeah.
And so how do we do that? And so it does take an institution. It takes holding hands across networks of people to do that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well said.
Well, Brian, it has been an absolute joy to have you on here, Darkwood Brew, this evening. We thank you sincerely for your time, and because I know you, in contrast to what you implied earlier, you don't have a lot of time to spend on these kinds of things, and we really appreciate your presence and your wisdom this evening.
Well, thanks for having me. My only regret is that I didn't get a Reese's peanut butter cup, but that's okay.
We got an extra pack. We'll send it to you along with that Darkwood Brew T-shirt. So. And for those of you who are on the internet, we invite you to join us here in the Coffee House, too, in concluding our episode by remembering who we are and whose we are in the institution of communion. So we're reminded that, I think our discussion really points out very well this evening that you really can't move forward in this whole life of spirituality unless you also are willing to be broken apart. You really can't move forward until you're ready to take a dip into those elemental waters that tap deeply into the waters where God is moving the waters, not simply us, and take a risk. Take a risk even to try something and to fail. Sometimes our failures, sometimes what looks like failures, actually, with God's hands, turn into even our greatest successes. And so we remember on a night of betrayal and desertion, Jesus taking bread And after giving thanks, he broke that bread, saying, "This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this as often as you eat of it in remembrance of me." And so likewise, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink of it in remembrance of me." By eating this bread and drinking this cup, we remember Christ's death. We celebrate Christ's resurrection. And we come to know that in this world of faith, when the body is broken and the blood flows, a new river of life emerges. And what we see now converges as well into a new thing, a new view of the love and grace of God in Christ. These are the gifts of God for the people of God. I invite you to enjoy the feast. Well, thank you for joining this evening for this special episode on Convergence Christianity. We invite you to continue the conversation on Facebook, and if this episode spoke to you, we encourage you to spread the word. By Monday about noontime, we have the episode posted on the Darkwood Brew site. We'd love for you to share links to that episode with all of your friends. And we also invite you to join us, or invite your friends to join us, for the rebroadcast. Every Darkwood Brew is rebroadcast on Sunday evenings at 9 p.m. Central, 10 p.m. Eastern. Partly we do that in order to pick up the left coast folks, who that's 7 p.m. Pacific time. So also we invite you to join us next week for our new series, which will begin, a 6-part series called Failing, Falling, and Flying, Genesis Stories of Original Grace. And we'll be featuring next week Director of Hellbound, Kevin Miller. So look forward to that, seeing you again next week. Until then, my friends, may the Spirit of the living God, made known to us most fully in Jesus Christ our Lord, go before you to show you the way, go above you to watch over you, go behind you to push you into places you may not necessarily go yourself, go beneath you to uphold you and uplift you, go beside you to be your strong companion, and dwell inside you to remind you that you are surely not alone, and you are loved beyond your wildest imagination. And may the fire of God's blessing burn brightly upon you and within you, now and always. Amen.